This is the new 2021 Audi SQ5, and it's a sporty luxury compact crossover with 350 horsepower from a turbo V6 and a 0 to 60 time of under 5 seconds. It's also been heavily updated for the 21 model year, and today I'm going to review it. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, my new enthusiast car auction website for cool modern cars. We've had some great sales success lately, especially with SUVs. We recently sold this Toyota 4Runner TRD Pro for around $38,000. This Porsche Cayenne Turbo was sold with no reserve for almost $23,000. And this North American spec Land Rover Defender was sold for $40,000. If you're looking to sell your cool SUV or any cool car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, sell it with Cars and Bids at carsandbids.com. Now, I've borrowed this new SQ5 from a viewer here in the San Diego area, and I'm going to start with a little overview. The original SQ5 was one of the pioneers of the luxury, sporty, compact SUV segment. It came out back in 2014, whereas BMW didn't come out with an X3M until last year. The current SQ5 has about 350 horsepower and a starting price of around $55,000. Unfortunately, these days, 350 horsepower isn't much in the sporty luxury compact SUV segment. The BMW X3M and the Mercedes-AMG GLC 63 both have 470 horsepower, and even the toned-down X3 M40i and the GLC 43 have 380 horses, so a bit more than the SQ5. But the SQ5 is also a little cheaper, and since it had a head start by going on sale a few years earlier, it seems to be pretty popular. And today I'm going to review the latest SQ5, which was updated for the 2021 model year. First, I'll take you on a tour of the SQ5 and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug's score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the SQ5 by discussing some of its sporty exterior touches. Starting right here, you have red painted brake calipers to emphasize the sportiness of this SQ5 over the standard model. You also have these wheels, these big 21-inch sporty looking wheels that even say Audi Sport in one of the spokes, just to remind you how sporty they are. On the side of the car, you also have these black painted rocker panels that make the car look visually smaller and more agile, again contributing to the sporty image. And in fact, the SQ5 is so sporty that it even has quad exhausts, 4 exhaust pipes back here. Very rare, usually they see that on V8 or V10, V12 high performance cars, but it's on the SQ5. Except that it isn't. If you look under the exhaust, you can see the actual exhaust is a single pipe and it's mounted a little further forward. These quad exhausts on the bumper are dummies. They're fake. They don't do anything except look like quad exhausts, even though they're not. Now, this is especially notable because the previous SQ5, last year's model, was always getting made fun of for having this sort of fake-looking exhaust thing on the bumper, even though you could clearly tell it wasn't exhaust. So when this model came out, I was pretty excited. They finally ditched the fake exhaust and gave it a real quad exhaust like a performance SUV should have, except they didn't. It's even faker than before. Now it's just openly trying to trick you, even though this is just a little plastic piece that's in the bumper. It's not actually an exhaust. So there are some sporty touches on the outside of this car. The exhaust isn't one of them. It's a fake sporty touch. But anyway, next up, since I'm back here, let's talk over a few other interesting exterior items on the SQ5, starting with the brake lights, which are attached to the tailgate. So when you put the tailgate up, the brake lights go up with it. Now, I have previously told you in earlier videos that brake lights and headlights cannot be mounted on a movable piece of bodywork by regulation here in the United States. So how does Audi get away with having their brake lights on a movable piece of bodywork? It's actually a clever solution. You have the brake lights, as you can see, but you also have this second set of lights in the bumper. And what happens is, I'm pressing the brake right now, the brake lights are on, I put up the tailgate and you can see the brake lights jump jump from the regular brake lights to this second set of brake lights in the bumper. So even when the tailgate is up, your brake lights are still on, and they're still showing vehicles behind you that you're stopped, and so that way they meet the regulation. You put the tailgate back down, and again, you can see the brake lights eventually jump back to the original brake light location and out of the bumper. And the same is true for the turn signals. You have the turn signal on, you can see Audi's beautiful sweeping turn signal, but if you open the tailgate, the turn signal jumps to the second set of brake lights and turn signals in the bumper. And again, same deal. If you close the tailgate with the turn signal on, it's in the bumper, then it closes, and then the turn signal switches back to the regular brake light. This allows Audi to meet the regulation while still creating the design they want with the brake lights in the tailgate. I imagine it adds some complexity and cost to the car, but they do it anyway because that's how they wanted it to look, that's how they wanted to design it. And next up, here's another interesting regulatory item on the outside of the SQ5, this little plastic fin on the rear wheel well. There is a regulation in North America that the wheels cannot stick out past the body of a car. And so Audi has to install this little plastic fin on the rear wheel arch to make sure that the body is completely covering the rear wheel. That's not that uncommon. A lot of cars have to do this. The interesting thing about the SQ5 is it also has one in the front. If they didn't have this little plastic fin, I guess the front fender wouldn't quite cover the front wheels, and so they have to install front and rear little plastic fins in order to comply with this regulation. Interesting. Next up, a few more items worth discussing on the outside. I like the look of the SQ5. I think it's a very handsome SUV. Looks nice, nothing particularly weird or upsetting about it. It's just a good design, but I must say, I've also thought that about the last couple of Q5 models. They've all looked about the same. Audi has clearly taken a very slow, evolutionary design point of view rather than giving some new, radical, interesting redesign each time. That's very different from, say, Mercedes-Benz, big rival to this car. The GLK initially looked like this, very distinctive design, and then it became the GLC and looks like this, a very big design change. Audi doesn't really do that. All the Q5 models kind of look the same, regardless of how old they are. Next up, since I'm up here, some interesting front items in this car. One is the fog lights. You can see the fog lights mounted in their usual place at the base of the bumper where they are in most cars, except those aren't actually fog lights, they're fake. Now, unlike the exhaust in the back, these aren't just dummies, they have a purpose. This is where the radar sensor is, for radar cruise control and other similar features. They've taken the place of the fog light, but they look like fog lights. Now, the benefit of putting the radar sensors here is you don't have to have some ugly hole in your front grille where it's very obvious the sensor is mounted. Instead, you can kind of put it down in the bumper where people won't even really think that it looks out of place. But speaking of the grille and fake things, you can probably tell the grille is mostly fake. You can see the opening part of the grille is like half the size of the actual grille. The rest of it, I guess, is just there for style to fit in with other Audi models with this grille design, but most of that grille isn't real. A lot of fake stuff on the outside of this car. And next up, we move into the SQ5. You can see the interior in here looks a lot like the interior of other new Audi models. A lot of the same design, same switches, although you don't have the dual screen setup that some of the other new Audis have, where you have one screen on the top and then a second lower screen in the center as well. That's on some of the higher end cars, the Q7, the Q8, the RS7 that I've reviewed, but it didn't make it into the SQ5, at least not this time. With that said, the upper screen in this car is excellent. It behaves a lot like the other infotainment screens in the other Audi models I've reviewed, and frankly, it's intuitive, it's easy to understand, it's very responsive to your touch. No real complaints with this screen. It seems pretty simple to use. Now, next up, below that screen, instead of a large second screen like those other Audis have, you do have a smaller screen in here, but it's only for your climate controls, and it provides only a small amount of information like your current fan speed and that sort of thing. Nothing particularly interesting or unusual about this, just your typical climate control screen. But speaking of screens in this car, the screen I like the best is in the gauge cluster. I love how configurable it is, and I love the fact that you can have various different pieces of information displayed right in front of you, virtually right in your line of sight, so you don't really have to look too far off the road to see what's in there. And you can change the view and basically see whatever you need to in there. One interesting thing about this display is the speedometer, at least in the current display mode, is bizarre. You have your digital speed readout, but you can see there's also like a display for the speedometer, and it's this straight line with intervals of 40 miles an hour, and you have this weird little loop thing that is in the Audi S colors that kind of touches whatever speed you're going. It's very strange and not helpful at all to actually figure out your speed. The digital display is all you'll be really looking at. I wonder why they even bother with such a strange looking speedometer. Certainly one of the most unusual I've ever seen. But anyway, in this gauge cluster, this is the part in Audi reviews where I usually talk about how much I love the fact that you can have the map directly in front of you, so you can just look down and see where you are. Except this car doesn't have a map. That's because this car doesn't have a navigation system. This is a $65,000 SQ5, and navigation isn't included. You can see I go to the center screen and it says navigation has not been purchased, very clear there, making you feel like you didn't spend enough, even though you spent 65 grand. Totally insane it doesn't have nav. With that said, a dealer can install the navigation software pretty much at any time and give you nav, but this car also has Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, meaning that you can just use the navigation system that comes with your phone if you want to, so maybe nav isn't really that big of a deal. It's interesting, for so long that was a really important feature, and now maybe it's becoming less and less important. The owners of this car told me they don't really use nav because they're using Apple CarPlay instead, so it wasn't worth the extra money. Still kind of funny to see a car at this price point that doesn't have navigation. But anyway, moving off the tech in this car, some other interesting quirks and features in this interior. One thing, I love all the carbon fiber trim in here. You have it on the dashboard going across the whole dash. You have it in the center console around the gear lever area. You have it on the doors. It all just looks really sporty. Usually carbon fiber doesn't make its way into vehicles like the SQ5, sort of the lower end of the Audi performance range, but it's nice to see it in here. It emphasizes the sportiness. Same deal with the seats. These diamond stitch contrast stitching seats that look heavily bolstered. These are pretty cool, and again, they emphasize the sporty feel in this car. And same deal with the steering wheel. You have the sides of the steering wheel with these little ridges that again make it feel a little bit sportier, a little bit more special than your standard Q5. Next up, another thing I like in here, in the center you have the cup holders, of course, two of them, one for driver, one for passenger. They're just kind of exposed unless you want to cover them, and the cover is the wireless cell phone charger. You can move the wireless charger back or forward depending on where you want it to be. That is pretty interesting. I've seen a lot of cars with wireless cell phone chargers, never seen a movable one before, but this car has it. One other interesting quirk in here is on the windshield wiper stalk. To adjust the intermittent wiper frequency, you have this tiny little switch on the stalk itself, which is odd, but I especially like the little depiction of 1 raindrop versus 3 raindrops, depending on how much rain is falling. You move it over to 3 raindrops if it's a rainier day and you want faster intermittent wipers. A cute little switch with cute little pictures. And next up, we move on to the back seat in the SQ5. You can see not very roomy back here for legs. This front seat is about where I would sit if I were the driver, and sitting back here, I have enough space, but my knees are digging into the back seat. It's just not a huge amount of space. Then again, this is a luxury compact crossover. The Q5 is a little bigger than some of its compact rivals, but it's still relatively small. And it's worth noting, headroom is excellent. I can sit up here. I have pretty good headroom. Not really a problem there. The issue is really more with legroom and knee room. Now, there's nothing particularly interesting in the back seat of this car except the climate control situation. This car has 3-zone climate control, 2 zones in the front, like a lot of cars, and then a zone in the back seats as well. But there's not much control back here. You only have 1 climate control, and that is this plus-minus button to adjust the temperature. Everything else, including the fan speed, is done in the front. So you can adjust the temperature of the air that's blowing at you, but you can't adjust how much air is blowing at you. It doesn't really feel like 3-zone climate control, since you don't have that much control over your air. At least you can control the temperature. Now, it's worth noting right below the climate controls, you can see you have 2 USB ports for charging for rear passengers, and you have a cigarette lighter style outlet back here as well, so there's good charge ports in the back seat of the SQ5. You also have this little folding center armrest, which is of course nice, and in the middle of it, you press this button and you have cup holders pop out that seem needlessly complex. It wouldn't be a German car if there weren't overly complex cup holders. And finally, we move on to the cargo area. Nothing particularly interesting back here. It's just a cargo area for a crossover, though I will say it does look a little bigger than its rivals, the X3 and the Mercedes GLC. Seems just a little bit larger, but other than that, pretty standard. You can use these little latches on the side to fold down the rear seats to give yourself a little bit more cargo space back here, but that's pretty standard, pretty common. You just have your SQ5 cargo area. And so those are the quirks and features of the new 2021 Audi SQ5. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the SQ5. For years, this was kind of the gold standard, sporty little luxury SUV. There weren't really many other competitors. And then BMW and Mercedes realized what they were missing out on by not making their top engine smaller SUVs be more sporty. And so BMW came out with the X3 M40i, which has been selling really well, and the GLC 43 also came out. And those are pretty big challenges to this car. I mean, on paper, they're more expensive, but they have more power. Audi has updated this car to try to take those on a little bit better. But ultimately, the thing about this car that I don't really love is it came out back in 14, and I think Virtual Cockpit was just coming out, the gauge cluster screen thing, and it had 350 horses, and it was, this cool new thing. Well, now, like 8 years later, most of that stuff is still true. Virtual Cockpit, 350 horses, it hasn't really moved the game forward. And frankly, Audi should have given this car more power over the years. And really, that reality does become clear when you drive the car. Audi says 0 to 60 in like 4.7, 4.9, something in there. You floor it. It's got good pickup, but it doesn't feel like a truly sporty car in today's world, especially when it's compared against rivals like the GLC 43. And it feels nice, it feels relatively quick, but it's not like very fast. This isn't something you would get in and say, wow, this is really fast. Now, that's not a big problem. This is only the SQ5. It's the mid-level model, but the issue is there's no RSQ5. So this is as good as it gets if you want like an Audi performance SUV. Meanwhile, rivals, Mercedes and BMW both have sportier vehicles. And there's other stuff too. Obviously the Macan, which maybe is why they don't make the RSQ5, they're afraid to compete there. But you have the Alfa Stelvio Quadrifoglio. There's a bunch of good, really sporty cars in this segment, and Audi just doesn't make one. With all that said, as for the actual driving experience of this car, it's pretty good. I love the interior in this car, and in all modern Audis, very luxurious, very nice. Doesn't have the dual screen, which I do like. I think that would make this interior even better. But otherwise, it's nice in here. Everything well screwed together, feels good to touch, as all Audi interiors are. Just very good. The car itself handles and steers pretty well. That's always been a bit of an SQ5 strong point. It's sharp. It steers sharp, more so than the regular Q5 for sure. You can definitely tell this car has a sportier tune in terms of handling. I will say the ride quality is a little bit harsher than I was expecting. I suspect due to these 21-inch wheels and probably the sport suspension that's put in the SQ5 models. It's definitely not as compliant as a regular Q5, but it feels, fine. But if you live in an area with a lot of bumpy roads, if you're in like Michigan or New Orleans or the Northeast in the spring, you might find that this car has a bit of a harsh ride compared to what you were expecting. Maybe in some of those areas you leave your smaller winter tires on for a little bit longer. Overall, there's really not that much negative to say about this car. It drives well. I think it could be a little quicker. That's a bit of a demerit. It doesn't have the dual screen like latest Audi interior, but there's a lot of benefits here. There's a lot to like. It does have good tech. It feels nice on the road. It's reasonably priced compared to the competition, and it's relatively quick and relatively sporty. It's a good car. There's a reason why they sell a lot of them, frankly, and they do. They really do sell quite a few of these. I see them fairly frequently, and I still see them more than the X3 and the GLC, which tells me that Audi really got in there. They got in first, they got in early, and they've really pushed this car. The SQ5, this is the one you want, and they've been rewarded with strong sales, with good reason. It's a great car. And so that's the 2021 Audi SQ5. This is a nice car. It has good tech, it looks good, it drives reasonably well. It's generally great, except for those stupid exhausts. It was greater, though, before BMW and Mercedes-Benz showed up with rivals to the SQ5, which have more power. And now, frankly, this car feels a little bit outclassed. It could use some extra grunt or maybe an RS Q5 version. But anyway, now it's time to give the SQ5 a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the SQ5 is reasonably attractive, not exotic sports car beautiful, but it looks nice and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in the high 4-second range and it gets a 6 out of 10. Handling is fine, a bit lazy, not exactly high performance SUV fun, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Fun factor is also fine, not incredibly fun, but it's enjoyable enough for a compact luxury crossover. It gets a 4 out of 10. Cool factor is low. These aren't especially cool, even though they're an S car, because they're pretty common and not really that enthusiasty, but the SQ5 is still relatively powerful and and quick, and it gets an acceptable 4 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 25 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The SQ5 has a lot of good stuff, but it's also missing some obvious things like cooled seats and navigation, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Comfort is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Same deal with quality, very nice inside, pretty normal for a car like this, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Practicality is also normal given the size, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Finally, value, and this is a nice vehicle with good equipment and performance, but it could certainly be more of a thrill or a bit better equipped. It's good enough, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 34 out of 50. Added up, and the DOUGSCORE is 59 out of 100, which places it here against some relevant cars. Truthfully, I haven't tested any very close competitor to the SQ5. The BMW X3M scores better, but it's also way more expensive and higher performance. The Mercedes GLC 300 scores worse, but it's not a performance crossover. The SQ5 does well for what it is, and I do recommend it in this segment. It's just not as sporty or engaging as some Audi S models.